Farrakane. I'm the public affairs specialist for Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. I'd like to take this time to really thank my team at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park for allowing this to happen, taking time out of their busy schedule, and especially thank USGS for taking time out of their extremely busy schedules. Here in the park, we have the park events to deal with. USGS has a whole second part of the eruption to deal with, so we greatly appreciate you folks being here. We have USGS scientist in charge, Tina Neal, who is going to speak, as well as Don Swanson and Kyle Anderson about the changing eruptive conditions here specifically at the summit. Then we will have our Chief Ranger, John Broward, will speak to the park closure. We'll give everybody about 5 minutes or so this whole part should take about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some questions and answers for you with any of the folks that are here. Our superintendent is actually, we have an acting superintendent today, and this is Dr. Rhonda Lowe, who was also here. So if you have questions for her, we can address those afterwards also. But in the sake of time, we figured we would just have John and the scientists talk. Before the speakers begin, I would like to remind media and the public that this is a partial closure. The entire park is not closed. The Kahuku unit is open. It is now open 5 days a week, from Wednesdays through Sundays from 9 to 5. And our park rangers continue to serve the public and our visitors at various locations, including the Volcano Art Center Neolani campus here in Volcano Village, as well as Mokupapapa Discovery Center. We're also at the airport and the Port of Hilo on certain days. So we continue to work here in the park and continue to serve our community. And without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our chief scientist, Tina Neal. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's in some ways a little bittersweet to be here today on such a beautiful day. This is about as gorgeous as it gets in Volcano. And the bittersweet part of that is that with the park being closed in this area, and with HVO being out of the building, and with the profound impacts to people going on in Lower Puna and in Volcano and the rest of the island, it's just a time to think about how somber that component of what's going on is now. Change is the word that occurred to me today as I drove up here and started to look out over the caldera rim, because change is really the fundamental process going on right now, and change is what volcanoes do. Kilauea volcano has been in a constant state of change, and indeed what we're seeing happen today has happened before. It's unprecedented in our modern observational period, but change is what volcanoes do. And so I also want to say that despite there being this profound sense of loss going on with partial closures of the park and the destruction in Lower Puna, it's also for our scientists a very inspirational time because of that change. And if you think back to the founding of HVO more than 100 years ago, it was put here because of the rapid pace of change at Kilauea and how active Kilauea volcano was. Dr. Jagger recognized that this was a perfect place to establish a laboratory to study volcanic processes, so that we would better understand how they can potentially impact society and give us the ability to warn people ahead of time and allow us to live safely with volcanoes. So it is an inspirational time, and in fact, I think HVO scientists, even though we're dealing with the disruption, are really engaged scientifically trying to figure out what is happening to give the best guidance to the national park and other emergency authorities and indeed the public so they can make good decisions about their own safety. As I think what's going on behind me here, I just noticed there's a gaggle of cars out at the at the Keanakekoi Overlook. That's the UAV team that's been working up here for the last more than a month to obtain UAV footage of the closed area, the very hazardous area. So indeed, we're bringing new tools to the table now, which I think Dr. Jagger would be very approving of, to allow us to gain the knowledge to better understand what's going on. At this point, I just would like to introduce my colleague Kyle Anderson, who's a research geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and he has been thinking long and hard about all the processes going on to create this ongoing subsidence of the caldera and how it relates to the Lower East Rift Zone eruption. And Kyle, and then later Don Swanson, who many of you know as an expert on the history of Kilauea, will talk more about the science of what's going on now. So, Kyle?
Thanks, Tina, and good morning. I'm just going to give a brief overview on what's happening right now at the summit. I'll leave a lot of time for questions, and I think you will certainly have questions. I know that we do. In our conceptual model of what's happening right now, magma is rising up beneath the summit of Kilauea from its supply region. It's passing through the summit storage reservoir system and then migrating down the rift zone where it's either stored or erupted. Because the rate of magma exiting the summit storage system, the summit reservoir, is so much greater than the rate at which magma is supplied to that reservoir, the summit magma reservoir is deflating. You can think of that a bit like air being let out of a balloon. That's causing subsidence, cracking, and deformation across a broad and widening region of Kilauea caldera, which you can see behind me here. The rates of that subsidence are, in some places, particularly close to Halemaumau crater, very large, as much as 30 feet or more per day. The bulk of this deformation, this slumping, is happening episodically. Over recent weeks, that's been about once per day. Earlier in the eruption, this slumping gave rise to vigorous ash plumes and the ejection of ballistic fragments to the regions surrounding the crater. More recently, that has not been true. Very little ash is being emitted currently, but these slumping events are producing large earthquakes, which are felt very strongly in the Kilauea summit region. So again, this slumping, we believe, is happening because magma is exiting the summit storage system rapidly, and so rock, which composes the floor of the caldera, is slumping downwards and inwards to replace magma, which is being evacuated towards the rift zone. As a result, the crater, Halemaumau crater, is enlarging quite rapidly. As of our most recent measurements, it's increasing at a rate, the volume of that crater is increasing at a rate of more than 10 million cubic meters every day. And again, some of the crater floor, the caldera floor around the crater, subsiding 30 feet or more per day. As of now, the bottom of the crater, again, this is our most recent measurement almost a week ago, the bottom of the crater is about 400 meters below the level of the old caldera floor. So it's subsiding and getting larger at a very high rate.
Jessica?
That's fine. All right. Chief Ranger John Broward, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park.
Well, good morning, everybody. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the closure itself and a little bit about the background and the history of the closure. So back in early May, about around May 5th, is when we had our first set of earthquakes started occurring. And at that time, we went into what's called Incident Command System, or ICS. And just a real quick understanding of what ICS is, in case you don't know. It stands for Incident Command System, and it's a national standard way of communicating and managing incidents, whether it's a parade or an earthquake or a hurricane. It's usually managed under ICS. So we initiated our park incident management team, and I became the IC, and some of our rangers filled different roles. After about 2 weeks of that, and we were working 14, 16-hour days, 7 days a week, it became quite clear that this was going to last longer than 2 weeks. So we went ahead and started ordering resources from the mainland. We had an IMT come in from the West Coast in Alaska, and they took over and managed everything so we can take a break and get some rest and try to do some of the other jobs that we have to do. After about a month of that, and we realized it was going to last a little bit longer still, we decided to go ahead and, in order to save money and try to reduce fatigue of our resources, we went back to our own park IMT. So I'm currently the incident commander for this month of June. Greg Funderburk, our fire management officer, will take over in July, and we'll just keep managing that way for the duration of this event. And we've scaled back our hours and our resources, so that's kind of where we stand as far as how we're managing this. As far as the closure goes, we started closing sections of the park around May 5th, and we just started closing off in sections as it became quite more and more clear that the seismic activity is only increasing and continuing, and also with the threat of ash and high levels of sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases, we decided that it's the best interest of the safety of the visitors to close the entire park. So we closed the entire park, and we start looking at sections of the park to open, and one of those areas included Kahuku, so we reopened Kahuku, which now, and just kind of a slight correction on what Jessica said, Kahuku is open until 3 o'clock in the afternoon and not 5, but we are looking at possibility of opening up longer hours, but we still haven't made a decision on that. So we've closed large sections of the park, and this is to protect the visitors, for visitor safety. And there's a couple of concerns we have. Number one, we're concerned Not so much about a catastrophic event where there's a major earthquake and we have a huge collapse or anything like that. It's still something we want to keep as a concern, but it's not our primary concern. Just little damage that we get for the roads and from buildings and things like that, where we can't, if we had visitors in a particular building, there's an earthquake and part of the roof collapses, or the floor cracks or something like that, and somebody gets hurt that way. So we're worried about little things, smaller scale things like that. We're also worried about and concerned about the roads. As you might have seen coming in here, there's quite a few cracks on the road, and some of these are getting larger on the main highway. And Hawaii Department of Transportation is doing a really good job of trying to keep up with these cracks. But there's a lot of side roads and things like that within the park that we're concerned about if we did allow visitors to go down those roads, where the crack could open up and potentially a car could get swallowed up, or perhaps just being able to access that area. So our other concern is accessing visitors. If somebody were in an area and there was an earthquake, it doesn't even have to be a large one, just big enough to cause a crack in the road, all of a sudden those visitors are cut off from assistance. If they need an ambulance or help, we want to be able to get access to them. So that's the other reason why we're closed as far as that goes. And kind of the underlying theme is uncertainty. We don't know where the next earthquake is going to open up. We don't know what effect that's going to have on our park or our park visitors. So without any, nothing in life is guaranteed, right? But with having that level of uncertainty of what's going to happen next and what's going to be isolated next is our largest concern. Since we don't know, we basically want to manage it for be as conservative as we possibly can for the safety of the visitors and park staff. That's all I have.
Take this time to answer any questions you have, so I can just field the questions for you. Does anybody have a question for any of our speakers?
Yeah. We know a lot of people have been cited by the dozens down below. How many people have you cited? How many people, to the best of your knowledge, have tried to sneak into the park and haven't even got as close to the Jagger area?
Yeah, well, fortunately, we haven't had a lot. We're averaging about 2 people a day. Some of them are sort of innocent straying into closed areas, and some of them are intentional. We really, for about the last month or so, we really haven't had anybody really intentionally trying to get into a closed area, because in reality there's not a lot to see. There's the crater that you can see right now, but some of those folks were coming at nighttime, and it's a little bit harder to find people at night, but there's really nothing to see. So to answer your question, and kind of in general, about 2 people a day is what we're catching in the park.
Or is anybody being cited or arrested?
Some folks have been cited, like when they have an intention to get in the park and try to sneak past the rangers, and we find them in deep into the park, they get cited. Or if it's a second time, they come back a second or third time, then they get cited on the second or third time.
Do you know how many people have been cited? How many citations you've issued?
We've issued about approximately 30 since this all began.
Are these
Plus
under the same? Sorry to interrupt. Under the same rules that the state's doing it with the $5,000 fine?
So National Park is a good question, and let's clarify. National Park Service, in this national park, we're in what's called exclusive federal jurisdiction. So the federal government maintains the jurisdiction for the national park. We have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the County of Hawaii, and we could request, like if we need assistance, like if we need backup for our park ranger, we can bring people in from the county, but generally the county can't come in, or the state can't come in and write citations in the park, just like we can't go out in the state lands and write citations as well. But we could also respond to help the county for assistance, but we can't write tickets and take legal action on people. So the national park is under exclusive jurisdiction.
And what's the violation, and what's the fine, or what's the penalty?
So it's 36 CFR 1.5, which is a closure. And the superintendent in the national park has the authority to close the park for emergency purposes and to either protect people for safety, protect wildlife, protect park resources. So the superintendent has the authority to close sections of the park. And under that authority, Superintendent Cindy Orlando closed the park under 36 CFR 1.5.
Okay, I think she's asking, down below it's a 30-day or a year in jail,
so
$5,000
the penalties, the second part of your question, the penalty for a citation is a $100 fine, plus people would also have to pay a $30 administrative fee, so it's really $130. If they get caught a second time, or if it keeps happening, or if there's some reason why the ranger feels it's more appropriate to write a citation for a mandatory court appearance, the ranger has that discretion to write that. And if it goes to court, it's up to the federal magistrate to decide what the penalties are. And those could range anywhere from 30 days in jail to a $5,000 fine or somewhere in between. It's been my experience usually when we have had those cases, and not with the eruption at all, but other incidents we've had in the past of previous eruptions, when somebody goes to court, it's usually a couple of days in jail time with the magistrate will charge with.
I don't know who from USGS might be best to answer this, but since this used to be your office, can you guys just talk about what you have watched unfold in the last 2 months in terms of just the astounding change at Halemaumau crater and really the impact of the park closure as well? And perhaps maybe you both could answer that?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to hear the different perspectives.
And can we get you behind the mics as well? Thank you so much.
Astounding is a perfect word for it. I mean, it really is amazing. I used to have the privilege of having the office closest to the lava lake, and every morning I could look out there and see this amazing phenomena, the largest lava lake on the planet. And so to watch that drain away, and then to start to feel damaging earthquakes, and then to have to leave the building, and then watch the subsidence progress across the caldera floor, it truly is, on a personal level, pretty mind-blowing. And I have mixed emotions about it. But as I mentioned earlier, as a scientist, it really is an inspirational event. This is a once-in-a-career phenomena unfolding, and we have so much to learn from this that will help future generations and other volcanology groups around the world deal with similar situations. So it's a real mixture of sadness and loss, and also awe and challenge. As you'll probably hear from Kyle, I mean, the challenge of trying to figure out what's going on, and perhaps more importantly figure out what's going to happen, is epic. And this is in large part what volcanologists are born to do. So I don't know, Kyle, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I would echo that. My background is in ground deformation, so we study the way the ground deforms as magma enters or leaves storage systems, for example. We're used to looking at changes on the order of centimeters over years. That's a relatively large signal. Here, as I mentioned earlier, the scale of change is tens of feet per day in some cases. So the scale is just staggering. I had to go back to the mainland for a personal reason over the last week, and to come back here and see it again, even after only 1 week has passed, the scale of change is really breathtaking. I think we always knew that these, conceptually and physically, the processes that are happening behind us here, we knew that they could happen, but I don't think most of us thought that we would ever see it happen in our lifetimes. Explosive eruptions at the summit, this really enormous enlargement of Halemaumau crater. It's really tremendous, and as Tina mentioned, it's a scientific opportunity that I think is unrivaled. Our ability, and really we're just getting started. We're very wrapped up with eruption response at this time, obviously putting out instruments trying to understand what's going on from a hazards point of view. But the measurements that we're making now will inform scientific studies for generations, and I think tremendously improve our ability to understand the system. So it's pretty incredible to be here now.
Kyle, what do you know today about this volcano that we didn't know before May 3rd?
Well, one conceptual model we had when this activity started was that explosions at the summit of Kilauea were driven by interaction with groundwater. That was the model that we started with. That's what people believe happened in 1924 as well. It may still be true that water is playing a role, or did play a role in the explosions that happened earlier in May, but as of now we think that water was really only secondary to those processes, if at all. That in fact the explosions were driven more by the exsolution of magmatic gases. So that's a real change in our understanding, and obviously we're really just starting to explore the implications of that and to really have the chance to analyze the data to confirm that. But at least as a first pass, I would say that that really changes the way we think about explosive activity at the summit of Kilauea.
This volcano's been changing for a couple 100,000 years or so, give or take. We reference 1924, 55, Kalapana, and over the point of many, many years to come, when we're all gone, how big, how relevant will the activity, the eruption, the events of 2018 be?
I think people will be talking about this and writing about this for generations to come. Tina, would you agree with that?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, though, and that is in our human frame of reference, time is short, and so we don't have the long geologic reference really at our fingertips. But as Kyle said, this is a profound sequence of events here at Kilauea, unprecedented really in modern times. So for that reason, it really stands out. I think we've known for a long time that Kilauea goes through explosive phases of activity. In fact, that's been much of Don Swanson's life work in the last couple of decades, and our understanding of that has grown. we are now seeing a taste of that, and of course it remains to see how it's going to play out.
Early on, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can you talk about, because you went through so many statistics and obviously there's so much data that you guys have collected over the last 8 weeks, for you both personally, what has been the figure, the statistic that perhaps is either most shocking to you, most surprising, that you just kind of keep coming back to?
I would say for me it's the one I already gave, that the volume of Halemaumau crater is enlarging at 10 million cubic meters every day, actually a little bit more. That's really hard to put in context. You can convert that to dump trucks per day or something. It works out to somewhere on the order of 130 to 150 cubic meters every second, averaged over the day. As I said, it's happening mostly episodically, but it's just an enormous number that's actually hard to conceptualize. But that rate of change is pretty staggering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are quite a few I could pull from the amount of degassing going on in the rift zone to the numbers of earthquakes that people up here in the volcano region are feeling. But I think one of the things that leaps to mind is this tremendous regularity that we seem to have moved into with these subsidence events, and watching the trends of earthquakes in between events, reaching up to more than 40 earthquakes per hour being detected, and then plateauing, and then culminating in one of these piston down drops. I think that regularity of the process is really what's striking me right now as phenomenal, and when we can fully understand what that means about the process, we'll understand this volcano much better.
I was going to say, how do you explain, or what is the cause of the regularity, and how regular is it?
Well, we're still mulling that over, but to me it means there's some repeatability to the process, and that the same volume of rock is being stressed and reacting in the same way, and the size of the collapse is at this point about the same each time, because we're getting the same volume moving, the same amount of energy being released.
And what's the timing?
Well, for a while there it was about every 24 hours. I think the time frame of repeat, do you remember the range?
It's increased, so yeah, over the course of the eruption, it's varied from, I think the minimum was less than half a day to a couple of days, but recently it's been a day or a little bit longer. Remarkably regular, really, in the sort of geological context.
Do you think the crater will expand to the point where it's going to reach all the way to Jagger? And if so, will you do something to remove the physical structure, or are you just going to let nature take its course?
Well, I'll let the park talk about the building management, because they own the buildings, but right now the subsidence and the collapse we've been seeing, at least in the Halemaumau area, appears confined by those large topographic caldera bounding faults. So we're not seeing much motion on the faults outside of that inner big caldera. And the deformation data, if anything, indicate that as the collapse progresses, it will stay within that topographic boundary. So for now, it looks like it will stay there. I don't personally expect anytime soon to see the big ground underneath Jagger and HVO collapse into the void.
Early on, there was talk about that this is a separate eruption from Pu'u'o'o. Has there any more thought, or what's the latest on that whole thing? Is this a brand new, eruption we're talking about?
Well, I don't mean to demean the question, because it's a good question, but we're not really working on that as something to focus on. It's clearly a different eruption site involving magma that wasn't all necessarily in the Pu'u'o'o region. So in some ways it's a semantic question whether it's a new eruption or not.
But has it impacted the Pu'u'o'o? What's happened?
Well, Pu'u'o'o of course collapsed on April 30th, and we've seen no activity since then. It's really been quiet. It's putting out a very minor amount of sulfur dioxide. There's no visual indication that magma is coming back to the surface at Pu'u'o'o. It's still subsiding. So it's out of the picture for the moment.
Do you expect to one day see lava re-emerge back in this caldera? It would take a lot of it to fill it up, obviously, but...
That's one thing I am certain of. Someday there will be lava back in Kilauea caldera. We just cannot say when.
What about Pu'u'o'o?
That's a little harder to say. I think it's most likely that that's over for now. We've got a totally new eruption site that's taking magma from the Lower East Rift Zone at a steady rate, and it shows very little sign of change right now. So as long as that is going on, I would be very surprised to see anything return to Pu'u'o'o.
Is it possible to estimate how long this subsiding will continue for?
Kyle, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, that's an extraordinarily difficult question. sort of the big picture, it will continue for as long as material is evacuating towards the rift zone more rapidly than it's resupplied from its source region. We don't have any evidence that the rate of supply to the summit has changed. We don't have any good numbers on that right now, but we sort of can assume to first order that it probably hasn't changed a whole lot. So what's changed is that the rate of evacuation towards the rift zone is incredibly high. And that's probably, well, it's certainly caused in part by the eruption in the lower east rift zone. Fissure 8 is putting out a tremendous volume of lava, which is coming ultimately from the summit. The other piece of that makes this much more difficult to answer is that there may be additional storage in the rift. So all the magma that's leaving the summit is not necessarily all erupting or going to erupt at Fissure 8. There may be increased amounts of storage in the rift caused, for example, by that magnitude 6.9 earthquake. And that's something we don't have a good handle on. So in other words, even if the eruption in the lower east rift stops, we can't say for certain that the summit subsidence is going to stop at the same time. So there's a lot of uncertainties that are on top of each other. How long is the lower east rift eruption going to last, and will that necessarily cause the end of the summit subsidence? In terms of the duration of the lower east rift eruption, we can look back to 1955 and 1960. Those lasted 30-some days and 80-some days. But those are really imperfect analogies. We don't know that that's going to happen this time. It could certainly go for longer, and it may not. So it's a really good question, I think, and we don't necessarily have a quantitative answer for that, unfortunately.
What would you expect to see if it does start to subside? Will it just be like somebody turning the faucet off, or will there be signs that it is backing off?
If the subsidence at the summit slows?
Yeah, just in general, the eruption and the lower east rift zone eruption. Will you know that it's coming to an end?
There's certainly a chance that the vigor of the lower east rift eruption will gradually decay with time. At the summit, what's been observed in the past is a decay of subsidence rate as the eruption rate drops. We may see that now. We haven't yet, but it's hard to say what's going to happen.
How are your instruments holding up? Is your network of sensors degrading at all? Or?
So the tech crew at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory has been working incredibly hard to reroute signal networks and to, for example, dust ash off of solar panels, which causes instruments to fail as the sun is blocked. We've lost a number of instruments into the crater caused by these blocks collapsing inwards, GPS units, etc. But overall, I'd say the tech crew has done a really incredible job of maintaining the network and even expanding it in the lower east rift, putting out new instruments to track the migration of the intrusion down there, etc. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Maybe providing you with like things that you weren't able to do recently, other recently.
Yeah, the one that really, well, there are a lot, but the one that really stands out is the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles. And this is being done in cooperation with the Park Service, and it's really allowed us to build actually elevation models of the crater, and that allows us to, those numbers that I gave you, that the crater was changing at 10 million cubic meters a day, for example, those come directly from the UAV flights. UAVs have also been used to measure gas emissions, the compositions of the gases and the rates that they're coming out of the ground. All of that would have been extraordinarily difficult without the UAVs, so it's really been a fantastic application and done a lot for the science.
Kyle, Ron Delow just noticed that right in front of us here, this little white jug is a seismometer. This was a part of a network that was deployed a few weeks ago by some partners from the University of Utah. They deployed several dozen of these up here in the caldera region, and then also down across the rift zone where the eruption site is now. And these are providing very dense seismic data that will give us better illumination of the magmatic system and processes going on here. So this harkens back to the comment I made earlier that even in the midst of the loss of what's going on now, there's a tremendous opportunity to just learn a lot with these new tools that you mentioned and new approaches.
What's the current width and depth of the crater?
You know, the width is a difficult question to answer because it's not a clearly defined boundary. There's so much slumping around Halemaumau that it's a good question. I would say that it's probably at least doubled in diameter, but again, it's a bit subjective. As for the depth, the most recent measurement we have was, I think, a little less than a week ago, and the bottom was about 700 meters above sea level. So that's it's about 400 meters below where the old caldera floor was, which is about a little over 1,000 feet.
So maybe about 1,000 feet right now.
Yeah, so the caldera floor around Halemaumau has also subsided, but I would say that it's dropped, yeah, maybe 1,000 feet. Previously from the caldera floor, to the floor of Halemaumau was a drop of about 80 meters, I think, a little less than that. Now that's over 400.
Wait, can you just repeat what you just said? The what to the what?
So yeah, so everything's moving out there, so it's a little hard to
Yeah.
pin things down. In the old days, before this eruption started, from the floor of Kilauea caldera to the floor of Halemaumau crater, that was about 80 meters of vertical elevation, a little less than 100. Now the floor of Halemaumau has dropped it's now about 400 meters below where the caldera floor used to be. So it's dropped by several hundred meters.
I have one last question. While we understand that the origin right now of feeding or fueling the lower East Rift Zone, Fissure 8, and the rest of that sort of lava flow, you guys now believe is coming from Halemaumau crater. Where is Halemaumau crater's magma coming from? And is that an unlimited, unending, unstoppable supply?
Yeah, so a great question. The current thinking is that the magma which supplies Kilauea rises really from the mantle, from quite deep. That rises up below Kilauea, passes through the storage system, including the Halemaumau reservoir, and then migrates down into the rift zone. As I said before, we don't have any evidence that that's changed over recent weeks, although it certainly may have a little bit. Over longer time periods, it does change. It changes over a span of years and maybe even months, but it's been sort of in the big picture, it's been remarkably steady. It's fed the ongoing eruption, the eruption of Pu'uo'o since 1983. So that supply to first order is relatively constant, we think, during current activity.
With no indication it will end.
There's no indication that the supply to Kilauea is going to end anytime soon.